The subtle art of manipulation. There's a kind of darkness that doesn't shout. It doesn't come with raised voices, broken glass, or angry words. It comes quietly, disguised as concern, wrapped in affection, and delivered with the softest tone imaginable. This is gaslighting, a psychological manipulation so subtle that by the time you notice, you've already begun to question your own mind. Imagine this. You're in a relationship. You remember something clearly, a promise, an argument, a moment of kindness. But when you bring it up, the other person smiles gently and says, "That never happened." You feel confused. You're certain it did. But they seem so sure, so calm. So you begin to wonder, maybe I'm the one who's wrong. And that's how it begins. Not with control, but with doubt. Doubt planted like a seed, one that grows until your own perception no longer feels like home. The term gaslighting comes from a 1944 film titled Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into thinking she's losing her mind, dimming the lights in their home and denying it when she notices. But outside of the movie screen, gaslighting has become one of the most dangerous forms of emotional control in modern relationships, not just romantic, but professional, familial, even societal. Because when you can make someone doubt what they see, you don't need chains to control them. Their own mind becomes the prison. In psychology, gaslighting is often described as a persistent attempt to distort another person's perception of reality. But beneath that definition lies something deeper, something Carl Jung might have called a dance between shadows. Because to understand gaslighting, you have to understand what drives a person to control another's sense of truth. And often, that control begins where their own fear lives. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named Adrian. To everyone around him, he was charming, the kind of person who always knew what to say, who made you feel safe when he looked at you. But behind closed doors, he had a way of turning every argument into a maze. If you confronted him about something hurtful he'd said, he'd laugh it off. "Why are you so sensitive?" he'd say. "You're imagining things." At first, it seemed harmless. But slowly, his partner began to lose confidence in her own memory. She started recording conversations on her phone just to check if she was crazy. And that's the cruel genius of gaslighting. It doesn't destroy your mind. It makes you destroy it yourself. Alan Watts once said, "We seldom realize, for example, that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own." Gaslighting exploits that very truth. It manipulates your inner dialogue, hijacking the voice inside your head until it starts echoing someone else's words. You stop asking, "What do I think?" and start asking, "What would they say?" That's the moment control is complete, when your inner world begins to orbit around their perception of you. But why do people gaslight? What makes someone so afraid of the truth that they must rewrite yours? Carl Jung believes the answer lies in what he called the shadow, the hidden part of ourselves we refuse to see. And in the next chapter, we'll explore how the gaslighter's manipulation is, in truth, a reflection of their own unconscious fear.
The mind's shadow. Carl Jung's perspective on projection and control. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In many ways, gaslighting is a performance directed by the unconscious mind. The gaslighter, the manipulator, isn't always fully aware of what they're doing. They act out of fear, shame, and a desperate need to control the chaos inside themselves. They distort reality for others because they cannot face their own. Jung believed that every person carries within them a shadow, the dark part of the psyche that holds all the traits we deny or repress. Our jealousy, our rage, our weakness, our guilt. Everything we can't bear to see in ourselves gets buried there. But here's the paradox. The more we hide our darkness, the more power it gains. When the shadow is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It finds another way to express itself, through projection. Projection is the psychological act of placing your unwanted qualities onto someone else. It's the mind saying, "That's not me, it's you." A person who cannot admit they are manipulative begins to accuse others of manipulation. A person who fears being powerless convinces themselves that others are weak or crazy. And so, the gaslighter's game begins. Let's take another story. Mira worked under a manager named Daniel. At first, he seemed encouraging, praising her creativity and calling her his right hand. But when Mira started getting recognition from upper management, something changed. Daniel began to subtly undermine her. He'd say things like, "People think you're overconfident," or "I heard you were a bit harsh in that meeting." None of it was true, but it made Mira question how others saw her. And that's how projection works. Daniel projected his own insecurity about being overshadowed onto Mira. By making her doubt herself, he regained control. Jung might have said Daniel was at war with his own shadow, terrified to confront the part of himself that felt inadequate. Alan Watts once observed that the ego clings to control because it fears dissolution. He said, "The desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing." That's the secret at the heart of gaslighting. The manipulator controls others to escape their own insecurity. But the more control they seek, the more fragile they become. It's a psychological Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail. Carl Jung described this process as a kind of psychic possession. When a person is ruled by their shadow, they stop being aware of their actions. They become puppets of the parts of themselves they've denied. That's why gaslighting can appear so confident, so calm, even righteous. It's not always about conscious deception. Sometimes, it's a desperate attempt to preserve a collapsing self-image. The gaslighter tells you, you're the problem, because deep down, they cannot face the truth that the problem is them. Consider a parent who constantly invalidates their child's emotions. When the child cries, they say, "Stop being dramatic." When the child protests, they reply, "You're making that up." Over time, the child learns to silence their own feelings, to doubt their reality. But what's really happening? The parent, unable to face their own unresolved emotions, their shame, their mistakes, projects those feelings onto the child. They rewrite reality to protect their ego. Jung might call this a defense of the persona, the mask we wear to appear good, in control, or morally right. The parent can't admit imperfection, so they force the child to carry their darkness. Gaslighting, then, isn't just manipulation. It's a defense mechanism turned weapon, a way for the ego to survive when it's too fragile to tell the truth. But like all illusions, it requires constant maintenance. And the one maintaining it is always at war, not with you, but with themselves. Alan Watts often spoke about the dance of reality, how our perception creates the world we experience. He said that when we try to control the flow of life, we only make it more chaotic. Gaslighting is that control taken to the extreme. An ego so desperate to maintain an illusion that it bends other minds to sustain it. But illusions cannot last forever. Eventually, the truth, like light through cracks, begins to shine through. And that's where we go next, to the philosophy of illusion and how reality, perception, and truth weave together in the mind of both the manipulator and the manipulated.
The Philosophy of Illusion, Alan Watts and the Nature of Perception. Alan Watts once said, "The menu is not the meal." In other words, the words, ideas, and perceptions we hold are not reality itself. They are merely representations of it. We live not in the world as it is, but in the world as we perceive it. Gaslighting preys upon that gap between perception and truth. It doesn't alter the world, it alters the lens through which you see it. And once your lens is controlled, reality itself becomes negotiable. Imagine you're walking through a house with tinted windows. Every pane colors your view slightly differently. Through one window, the world looks warm and golden. Through another, cold and blue. Now imagine someone quietly switching those panes while telling you nothing has changed. That's gaslighting, an invisible shift in perception that slowly warps what you believe to be real. In modern psychology, this process is linked to what's called cognitive distortion, a habitual way of thinking that twists how we interpret events. The gaslighter becomes a master of distortion. They rewrite memories. They reframe conflicts. They cherry-pick facts and feelings until reality bends to fit their version of the story. And because human beings are wired for connection and trust, the victim's mind begins to adapt. We start to think, maybe they're right. Maybe I did overreact. It's not weakness, it's psychology. Our brains crave coherence, even if that coherence is built on lies. There's a story of a woman named Elise who lived with a partner that constantly made small corrections. If she said they went out on Sunday, he'd say, "No, it was Saturday." If she recalled a kind word he once said, he'd smirk, "I never said that. You just imagine things." At first, these seemed like harmless disagreements, but soon she began to hesitate before speaking, to second-guess her memories, her emotions, even her sense of time. Alan Watts might describe this as the erosion of direct experience. He said, "We're living in a culture entirely hypnotized by the illusion of time, in which the so-called present moment is felt as nothing more than an infinitesimal hairline between an all-powerful causative past and an absorbingly important future." Gaslighting traps you in that illusion, between a rewritten past and an uncertain future, until the present itself becomes blurred. When you live in a manipulated reality long enough, your brain starts to restructure itself around the lies. Neuroscientists call this neuroplastic adaptation, the mind literally rewiring itself to align with repeated falsehoods.
That's why escaping a gaslighter doesn't just require leaving the relationship. It requires rebuilding your sense of truth from the inside out. Alan Watts spoke often about the illusion of control, that the more we try to dominate life, the more it escapes us. He said, trying to control the future is like trying to take the water out of the ocean with a bucket. Gaslighters live in that struggle. They control others not because they are powerful, but because they are terrified of losing control over themselves. Their manipulation is a spiritual panic, an ego afraid of disappearing. To them, being right becomes synonymous with existing, and so every contradiction, every question, every truth becomes a threat to their identity. In that sense, gaslighting is not just psychological manipulation, it's a metaphysical war for identity. Both the gaslighter and the victim lose themselves in illusion, one by constructing falsehoods, the other by internalizing them. But the interesting paradox, as Watts would remind us, is that illusion always reveals truth in the end, because when the ego tightens its grip, reality pushes back harder, and eventually the cracks begin to show. Elise, after years of being told she was too emotional, began journaling her days. At first, it was just therapy, a quiet space where her thoughts could live unedited. But slowly, she noticed something. The entries didn't match her partner's stories. He said she'd screamed. Her writing showed she had cried quietly. He said she forgot things. Her notes proved she remembered with painful clarity. The cracks appeared. The illusion began to crumble. And in that moment, Elise discovered something powerful. That truth doesn't need to be proven. It simply is. Alan Watts once said, "The more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless." Gaslighting thrives on permanence, fixed narratives, absolute truths, rigid control. But real life is fluid. Perception shifts, emotions flow, truth breathes. Once you learn to flow again, to trust the fluid nature of your own perception, the manipulator's spell begins to break. Because freedom doesn't come from proving them wrong, it comes from remembering that you were never crazy. You were simply convinced to stop trusting your own eyes. But knowing how gaslighting works is only half the journey. The real transformation begins when you start to see and heal the impact it leaves behind. When you reclaim your intuition, when you recognize your worth, when your voice, long silenced, begins to rise again. That's where we're heading next, into the light, into the process of breaking the spell and reclaiming your power.
Breaking the spell, recognizing gaslighting and reclaiming power. Once you begin to see the pattern, it's as if the fog starts to lift. The gaslighter's words no longer sound like truth, they sound like echoes of fear. And for the first time, you start to notice something. It was never about you. Psychologists say that the first step toward healing from gaslighting is awareness. Awareness is what breaks the trance. It's the moment you realize that the confusion you feel isn't proof of your weakness, it's evidence of manipulation. You see, gaslighting works because it targets the core of what makes us human, our need for trust, for validation, for emotional connection. It replaces empathy with control, conversation with confusion, and truth with narrative. But once you learn to observe instead of absorb, the power begins to shift. Carl Jung would describe this stage as integrating the shadow. To reclaim your reality, you must confront the parts of yourself that have been silenced, your doubt, your anger, your pain, and say, "You belong to me now." Because healing isn't about rejecting your darkness. It's about owning it so no one else can use it against you. Let's return to Mira, the employee from earlier, the one whose manager constantly undermined her confidence. One day, she attended a workshop on emotional boundaries. The instructor said something simple. When someone questions your reality, pause, breathe, then ask yourself, what do I know to be true right now? That single question changed everything. The next time her manager dismissed her ideas, she didn't argue. She simply observed. She noticed his tone, his timing, his nervous tapping fingers. And in that awareness, the spell broke. She realized his words were reflections of his insecurity, not mirrors of her worth. That's the key. Gaslighting feeds on reaction. It needs you to defend, explain, justify. Because every time you do, you hand over a piece of your power. But when you stop reacting, when you simply see, the manipulation starves. It collapses under its own weight. In therapy, this process is often called reality validation, a way of grounding yourself in your own perceptions through journaling, mindfulness, or trusted conversation. Dr. Robin Stern, a Yale psychologist who wrote The Gaslight Effect, explains that gaslighters use empathy as a weapon. They exploit your willingness to understand them, but healing begins when you redirect that empathy toward yourself. That's where self-awareness becomes your armor. Carl Jung said that who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. To look inside after being gaslit is to walk through the wreckage of a stolen identity. But it's also to discover the part of you that was never truly lost. Because deep within, beneath the confusion, beneath the self-doubt, there's a quiet truth waiting to be remembered. You've always known what's real. You were simply taught to stop trusting it. Elise from our earlier story once described her healing like this. It felt like learning to see again, but not with my eyes, with my soul. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped apologizing for things she never did. She began saying small, simple truths out loud. I remember what happened. I trust what I feel. I am allowed to exist without permission. Each truth was a key, unlocking her from years of silence. Alan Watts often said that awakening is not about finding something new, it's about recognizing what's always been there. He said, "You are something the whole universe is doing, in the same way that a wave is something the whole ocean is doing." When you finally step out of the illusion of gaslighting, you realize you were never small. You were simply made to feel that way by someone who could not bear their own smallness. To break free, you don't have to fight the gaslighter. You don't have to convince them of your truth. You simply have to stop participating in their reality. Here are the quiet tools of liberation. Silence. Don't argue. Observe. Distance. Emotional or physical space restores clarity. Documentation. Write what you experience. Reality lives in record. Connection. Share your truth with someone safe, a friend, therapist, or support group. Self-trust. Repeat, my perception is valid, my feelings are real. These steps don't erase the past. They don't make the pain vanish overnight, but they begin to restore something much more powerful: your alignment with truth. Carl Jung believed that healing requires a confrontation with the self. Not the self we perform, but the self we hide. Alan Watts would say that in this confrontation, we rediscover unity, the realization that there is no true separation between light and dark, illusion and truth. The shadow, once embraced, becomes wisdom. The pain, once understood, becomes freedom. When you finally reclaim your perception, you begin to see the gaslighter not as a monster, but as a mirror, showing what happens when someone refuses to meet their own darkness. And in seeing that clearly, you become free. In the next and final part, we'll explore what that freedom truly means, how to heal not just the wounds left behind, but the way you see yourself, how to rebuild your inner compass, and how to trust your reality again.
Healing, awareness, and inner freedom. Healing from gaslighting isn't about getting back to who you were before. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be, someone whose truth doesn't need permission to exist. You see, gaslighting doesn't just distort how you see others, it distorts how you see yourself. It teaches you to treat your feelings as unreliable witnesses, your memories as questionable, your intuition as dangerous. But the truth is, those inner voices you were taught to doubt are the most honest parts of you. Carl Jung once wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." The gaslighter's greatest success is convincing you that you are broken. Their greatest failure is that you eventually realize you never were. Because what they destroyed wasn't your truth, it was only your trust in it. And trust can be rebuilt. Healing begins with one simple act: listening inwardly again. That small, quiet voice that says, "This doesn't feel right. This feels true. This is who I am." At first, it's faint, hesitant, fragile. But each time you listen, it grows louder. Each time you honor it, it grows stronger. And slowly, it becomes your compass again. Psychologists who work with trauma survivors often describe healing as a return to embodied awareness, the ability to feel safe in your own body and trust your sensations again. That's where practices like mindfulness, journaling, and meditation help. They rebuild the bridge between mind and feeling, the very bridge gaslighting tried to burn. Alan Watts often reminded us that life is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. He said, "The more we struggle for life, as distinct from being alive, the less we live." So healing isn't about fighting your past or fixing yourself. It's about being alive again, fully, vulnerably, truthfully. Elise, months after leaving her gaslighting relationship, started painting again. At first, she was afraid to use color because she'd been told she was too expressive, too much. But one day, she picked up a brush and let her emotions spill onto the canvas. No plan, no perfection, just truth. When she stepped back, she cried. Not because the painting was beautiful, but because for the first time in years, she had created something that didn't need anyone else's approval. That's what healing looks like. Not revenge, not validation, just authenticity. Quiet and unapologetic. Carl Jung might say that this is when the psyche becomes whole, when the conscious self embraces the shadow not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Every wound becomes a window. Every scar becomes a map. And through them,
you find something no gaslighter can ever touch: your own awareness. Alan Watts beautifully described awakening as the recognition that you are the universe looking at itself. To heal from gaslighting is to realize exactly that your perception, your consciousness, is not fragile. It's vast. It's cosmic. No one can own your truth because your truth is not a sentence or a story. It's your being. So, if you're listening to this and you've been gaslit, questioned, or made to feel small, remember this: you are not broken. You are awakening. And every time you choose to trust your voice again, you step further out of their illusion and deeper into your reality. The light you've been searching for was never outside you. It was the part of you that kept whispering, even in silence, "This isn't right. I deserve better. I am still here." Carl Jung taught us to embrace the shadow. Alan Watts taught us to let go of control. And psychology teaches us to trust our awareness. When you combine all three, you don't just survive gaslighting, you transcend it. You become the observer of your own thoughts. You stop reacting to illusions. You become still, clear, free. And that's where true power lives. Not in being believed, but in knowing yourself. So breathe. You're not crazy. You're waking up.